Right now, while you're watching this, the world's most dangerous flashpoint isn't where the media tells you to look. The China-Taiwan situation has become the ultimate tripwire for World War III, and what's terrifying isn't the military buildup, it's how systematically you've been misled about who actually wants this conflict and why. Here's what they're not telling you. Taiwan isn't just about democracy versus authoritarianism, it's about semiconductor supremacy, about TSMC producing over 90% of the world's most advanced chips, the lifeblood of modern warfare, AI development, and economic dominance. Whoever controls Taiwan controls the future, and that's precisely why the military-industrial complex has been quietly engineering this crisis for decades. But here's where it gets deeper. China doesn't need to invade Taiwan to win. They're already winning through economic integration, diplomatic isolation of Taipei, and a long-game strategy that makes Western saber-rattling look desperate and reckless. The real question isn't if China will attack, it's why American power brokers keep pushing Taiwan toward a confrontation that serves Wall Street weapons manufacturers far more than it serves either Chinese or Taiwanese people. The secrets buried in this conflict reveal everything about how modern empires actually operate, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with something that should make you uncomfortable. Every single war narrative you've ever been sold followed the same pattern. First, they demonize the adversary, then they manufacture a crisis, and finally they present military intervention as the only rational choice. We saw it with Iraq's weapons of mass destruction that never existed. We saw it with Libya's humanitarian crisis that turned into regime change. We saw it with Syria's chemical weapons that led to a decade of proxy warfare. And now, right now, we're watching the exact same playbook unfold with China and Taiwan, except this time the stakes are exponentially higher because we're talking about two nuclear powers and the potential end of human civilization as we know it. But here's what makes the Taiwan situation uniquely dangerous and uniquely deceptive. Unlike those other conflicts, this one has a legitimate historical complexity that the propagandists can exploit. Taiwan's status is genuinely ambiguous in international law. Most countries, including the United States, officially recognize the One China policy, which means they acknowledge Beijing's position that Taiwan is part of China. Yet simultaneously, Washington arms Taiwan to the teeth, sends congressional delegations to Taipei in direct violation of diplomatic protocols, and treats Taiwan as if it were a sovereign nation. This isn't confusion. This is deliberate strategic ambiguity designed to maintain a permanent crisis that justifies endless military spending and keeps China contained. Now, I want you to understand something crucial about how modern imperial powers operate, because this is where the real secret lies. The goal is never actually to win wars anymore. The goal is to create profitable, manageable conflicts that can be sustained indefinitely. Afghanistan wasn't a failure, it was a 20-year success for defense contractors. Syria wasn't a quagmire, it was a proving ground for weapons systems and a mechanism for controlling energy corridors. And Taiwan isn't about defending democracy. It's about maintaining American hegemony in the Pacific while generating trillions in military contracts. The moment you grasp this, everything else makes perfect sense. Let's talk about semiconductors because this is where economics and geopolitics become inseparable. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, is not just another tech company. It's the most strategically important corporation on planet Earth. They manufacture over 90% of the world's most advanced chips, the 3-nanometer and 5-nanometer processors that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets to artificial intelligence systems. Whoever controls TSMC controls the technological future. Lose access to those chips, and your military becomes obsolete overnight. Your economy grinds to a halt. Your entire civilization reverts to a pre-digital age. This is why American policy toward Taiwan has become increasingly aggressive over the past 5 years. It's not because China suddenly became more threatening. China has been consistent about Taiwan for 7 decades. What changed is that Washington finally realized it's losing the technological race. Despite spending hundreds of billions trying to build domestic semiconductor manufacturing, America is at least a decade behind TSMC's capabilities. The CHIPS Act, that $52 billion subsidy package, is essentially an admission of failure. So instead of competing economically, the strategy shifted to military encirclement and the threat of war, because if America can't have technological supremacy, it will damn well make sure China doesn't get it either, even if that means turning Taiwan into a burned-out wasteland. But here's where it gets even more sinister. The people pushing hardest for confrontation with China are the same people who got wealthy from offshoring American manufacturing to China in the first place. Think about that irony for a moment. Corporate America spent 40 years hollowing out the American middle class by shipping factories to China, making fortunes from cheap labor and non-existent environmental regulations. They built China into an economic superpower. And now that China is actually competing with American dominance, these same elites want working-class American kids to die in a war to contain the very threat they created. It's not just hypocrisy, it's a business model. Let me tell you what the Chinese strategy actually is, because this is completely absent from Western media coverage. China isn't stupid. They've studied every American military intervention since Vietnam. They know that the United States hasn't won a conventional war against a peer competitor since 1945. They know that American military power is optimized for bombing defenseless countries, not fighting opponents with sophisticated air defense systems, hypersonic missiles, and numerical superiority. So China's approach to Taiwan is patience. It's economic integration. It's waiting for America's imperial overstretch to collapse under its own weight. Right now, Taiwan's economy is completely intertwined with mainland China. Over 40% of Taiwan's exports go to China and Hong Kong. Taiwanese companies have invested over $190 billion in mainland China. Hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese business people live and work in Chinese cities. This isn't the relationship between enemies. This is the relationship between estranged family members who still need each other. China's bet is simple. Keep deepening economic ties, keep offering Taiwan better trade deals than the US ever could, and eventually reunification becomes the rational choice without firing a single shot. Meanwhile, what's America's strategy? Sanctions that don't work, military exercises that provoke without deterring, weapons sales that enrich Lockheed Martin but make Taiwan less safe, and most absurdly, semiconductor export controls that are already failing because China is simply building its own chip industry from scratch, subsidized by a government that can mobilize resources in ways that make American industrial policy look like a joke. You cannot contain a civilization of 1.4 billion people with the work ethic and educational system that China has developed. It's fantasy. It's dangerous fantasy that could get us all killed. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the claim that this is about defending democracy and freedom. Taiwan is democratic, that's true. It's also a democracy that until 1987 was a brutal military dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek and his son, fully supported by the United States because anti-communism mattered more than human rights. It's a democracy where the United States has interfered in every single election, funding preferred candidates and running influence operations that would be called foreign interference if anyone else did it. And it's a democracy that Washington suddenly cares about after ignoring it for decades, precisely at the moment when Taiwan's strategic value increased. If this were really about democracy, America would be consistent. But we're allied with Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarchy that dismembers journalists. We support Egypt's military dictatorship with billions in annual aid. We just spent 20 years propping up corrupt authoritarians in Afghanistan. The democracy argument is marketing. It's the humanitarian intervention language repackaged for a new generation. And it works because it appeals to Americans' genuine belief in freedom and self-determination, weaponizing our best values to justify our worst policies. Here's something else they won't tell you. Taiwan's own population is divided on independence. The majority of Taiwanese people support the status quo, neither immediate reunification nor formal independence. They understand that declaring independence would trigger a war that would destroy their island regardless of who wins. They're not suicidal. They see what happened to Ukraine when it became a proxy battleground between Russia and NATO. They don't want that fate. But their preferences don't matter to Washington's strategic planners, who view Taiwan as a chess piece, not a nation of 23 million human beings with lives and families and futures. The war propaganda has ramped up dramatically in the past 3 years. Suddenly, every think tank in Washington is publishing reports about the imminent Chinese invasion. Every general is testifying before Congress about the threat. Every media outlet is running stories about China's military buildup. The Rand Corporation, which is basically the intellectual arm of the military-industrial complex, published a study gaming out a Taiwan war scenario. Their conclusion? Even if America wins, the economic cost would be catastrophic, the casualties would be in the hundreds of thousands, and the risk of nuclear escalation would be significant. And yet, having acknowledged all of that, their recommendation was still to prepare for war. This is the logic of madness. This is what happens when your entire economy is financialized and your only remaining competitive advantage is military force. You start seeing every problem as solvable through violence. You start believing your own propaganda. You start thinking that because you have 11 aircraft carriers and China only has 3, that somehow translates to victory in a conflict fought 3,000 miles from California and 100 miles from mainland China. It doesn't work that way. China doesn't need to match America's global force projection. They only need to control their own littoral waters, and in that environment, they have every advantage. Let's talk about what war would actually look like, because the sanitized versions you see in congressional hearings are criminally misleading. A war over Taiwan would start with massive Chinese missile strikes on US military bases in Japan, Guam, and South Korea. Those bases would be catastrophically damaged within hours. American carrier strike groups would face thousands of anti-ship missiles, forcing them to operate hundreds of miles away from Taiwan, greatly reducing their effectiveness. The air war would be contested, not the turkey shoot that Americans are used to from Iraq and Serbia, and Taiwan itself would be subjected to a blockade and bombardment that would collapse its economy and infrastructure within weeks. But the real nightmare scenario isn't even the military conflict, it's the economic aftermath. A war that closes the Taiwan Strait shuts down a significant percentage of global trade. Supply chains that took decades to build disintegrate overnight. The semiconductor shortage we experienced during COVID would look trivial compared to the total loss of TSMC's production. Every major economy would plunge into depression, stock markets would crash, currency systems would destabilize, and that's assuming the war doesn't go nuclear, which is a hell of an assumption when you're talking about the 2 largest economies on Earth with thousands of nuclear warheads between them. The people pushing for this confrontation will be fine, of course. They'll be in their bunkers or their New Zealand estates. Their portfolios are diversified across multiple countries. Their children aren't enlisting in the military. It's everyone else who pays the price, the working families in Taiwan who lose everything, the American service members who die on ships in the Pacific, the billions of people worldwide who suffer economic collapse and potential nuclear winter. This is class warfare disguised as geopolitics. Now I want to be clear about something, because nuance seems to have died in our political discourse. Criticizing American policy toward Taiwan doesn't mean endorsing Chinese authoritarianism. The Chinese Communist Party is a repressive regime that violates human rights, suppresses dissent, and operates a surveillance state that would make Orwell weep. Those things are true. What's also true is that American foreign policy isn't motivated by opposition to authoritarianism. It's motivated by maintaining global dominance. We can oppose both Chinese repression and American imperialism simultaneously. These aren't contradictory positions. They're the only intellectually honest position. The solution to the Taiwan crisis isn't military. It never was. The solution is diplomacy, which requires something Washington has forgotten how to do, treating other major powers as equals with legitimate security interests. China views American military presence in the Western Pacific the same way America would view Chinese military bases in the Caribbean. It's an existential threat. Acknowledging that doesn't mean surrendering to China. It means recognizing reality and finding a way to coexist on a planet that's too small and too armed for hegemonic fantasies. Finland and Russia managed to find a modus vivendi during the Cold War despite being on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain. Austria maintained neutrality while bordered by both NATO and Warsaw Pact countries. These models exist. They require compromise. They require giving up the idea that one power can dominate the entire world order. They require accepting that other civilizations have the right to develop and prosper without subordinating themselves to Washington's dictates. But none of this is acceptable to a bipartisan foreign policy establishment that's been addicted to primacy since 1991. What's happening with Taiwan is a test. It's a test of whether humanity can navigate the transition from a unipolar world order dominated by the United States to a multipolar world where power is distributed among several major civilizations. If we fail this test, if we sleepwalk into a war because we can't imagine any alternative to American dominance, then we're looking at a catastrophe that makes the world wars look manageable by comparison. If we pass this test, if cooler heads somehow prevail, then we might just build a more stable international system based on spheres of influence, mutual respect, and acceptance that no single nation gets to write the rules for everyone else. The propaganda will intensify, the war drums will get louder, you'll see more think tank reports, more inflammatory media coverage, more politicians competing to sound tough on China. You'll see the Taiwan question used to enforce political conformity, where anyone questioning the march to war gets labeled as a Chinese sympathizer or an appeaser. This is how it always works. This is the pattern that repeats throughout history, but you don't have to buy it, you don't have to accept the framing. You can ask who benefits from this conflict and who pays the price. You can demand actual diplomacy instead of brinksmanship. You can refuse to let your country stumble into another catastrophic war based on lies and manipulation. Because at the end of the day, the secret about the China-Taiwan situation isn't complicated. It's not about democracy versus authoritarianism. It's not about defending the international rules-based order. It's about a declining empire trying desperately to maintain dominance it can no longer sustain and being willing to risk global catastrophe rather than accept a more humble position in a changing world. That's the truth they're not telling you. That's what all the propaganda is designed to obscure. And once you see it clearly, you can never look at this crisis the same way again. The question is whether enough people will wake up to this reality before it's too late, before the point of no return, before the missiles start flying and we all discover that there are no winners in great power wars, only degrees of loss.